Good afternoon. My name is Jean McCormick, and I have the privilege of being the president of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. And you are sitting in the heart of the Institute, which is our exact size replica of the United States Senate. You'll notice it has a little bit more technology than the Senate in Washington. And everyone always asks us first, isn't the seat in the back a little lower? Yes, because we built our chamber after the American with Disabilities Act passed, and you have to be able to access it. So we couldn't build it the way the original chamber is. Senator Kennedy had a vision to create a place where people would get a chance to actually experience the democratic process, to understand the complex human process that it is, and what our founding fathers meant about being able to find solutions that are truly reflect diverse perspectives. He was very good at that as a legislator himself, and he was worried that we were getting cynical about how government works or doesn't work sometimes, and that he wanted to reinvigorate people's belief in the democratic process. He wanted the chamber to be here because he felt there's something about the place that changes people. Not on the first day you become a senator, but over time when you understand the seriousness of what happens in this place. So we are delighted to have this wonderful group here for Mass Humanities, a group I've been a strong supporter of, even in my days as Chancellor of the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. We welcome the opportunity to have you see us. Hope you'll come back at another time and visit and actually be a senator for a day. You get to participate in a program we call Today's Vote, where two actors present the Republican and Democratic position on an issue. They set the stage for you as senators in training, and you would be amazed at the dialogue that takes place on critical issues in this chamber among the general public, and certainly among our students who participate in a much longer 2.5-hour program. We are delighted to host you today, particularly for this forum and particularly for this very important topic. We are running a program in our chamber called Great Debates of the Senate, and the one that we are highlighting now is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's a multimedia live actor presentation. It happens to be the event and speech, which is Senator Kennedy's maiden speech, but we give highlights of Senator Byrd's speech, his 14-hour filibuster speech, and certainly the important closure speech of Everett Dirksen. It's been getting a great response from our audiences, but it precipitates the question, how far have we come? How far do we still have to go on these critical issues of civil rights? So I know this will be a wonderful panel. I know that there'll be an opportunity for dialogue, and I'm delighted that the Edward M. Kennedy Institute can host you tonight for this forum and for dinner. So now is my pleasure to introduce the chair of the board, Nancy Netson. Nancy, right here.
Well, thank you, Jean. And we thank you and the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for your generosity in hosting today's events. On behalf of the Mass Humanities Board of Directors, I'm pleased to welcome all of you to our 12th annual Fall Forum. It's wonderful to see such an enthusiastic turnout for what promises to be a stimulating and insightful conversation. Over the past decade, Mass Humanities has established a tradition of bringing together some of the best minds in our region to address fundamental issues concerning the health of our democracy through the lenses of the humanities. Today's forum is no exception. There's no more urgent or important issue than the state of racial justice in this country, and for too many of our fellow Americans, it is literally a matter of life or death. But it's also an issue in which we all are implicated and in which we all have a responsibility to redress if we can. Today, I expect we will gain a deeper understanding of the nature of the problems we confront and some direction toward possible solutions. To get us started, let me introduce David Tebaldi, Executive Director of Mass Humanities and the architect of our Fall Fora.
Thank you, Nancy. For those of you who do not yet know us, let me say that Mass Humanities is a nonprofit educational organization affiliated with the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Massachusetts Cultural Council. Established in 1974 as the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities and Public Policy, Mass Humanities provides grants and conducts programs like this one that use the humanities to enhance and improve civic life across the Commonwealth. The animating vision of Mass Humanities derives from Thomas Jefferson. I know of no safe depository of the ultimate powers of government, Jefferson wrote, but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their authority with a wholesome discretion, the cure is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion. By bringing the insights and perspectives of history, literature, philosophy, and the other humanities disciplines to bear on topics of interest and issues of concern to the people of our state, Mass Humanities fosters the Jeffersonian ideal of an informed and enlightened citizenry. Today's forum is clearly in keeping with this ideal. Lest I appear a little tone deaf, opening a forum on citizenship, justice, and racial conciliation with a quotation from a slave-owning founding father, let us use the provocation to remind ourselves that the issues we're about to discuss are very deeply rooted in our history and in our culture. Indeed, I think that is part of the challenge we face as we confront and seek to resolve them. Of course, every social or political controversy has a history. Understanding that history is crucially important and may even contribute significantly to a resolution. Beneath every social or political opinion are values propositions. Bringing those values to the surface where they can be examined, compared, and assessed in the light of other important values is essential to making wiser, longer-lasting public policy decisions. This is the role of the humanities. If you would like to know more about Mass Humanities or become involved in our programs, please visit our website at masshumanities.org and sign up for our e-newsletter and other communications. While you are there, consider making a tax-deductible donation to help us with our important work. We need your support. A few housekeeping details before we begin. Please mute or turn off your electronic devices. Books by our forum participants are on sale in the lobby in front of the EMK bookstore to the right as you go out these doors. Our panelists will stay and sign some books if you like. Those of you who are staying for our benefit dinner, please return to the reception desk. It's best to use these doors right here. In the lobby after the forum to pick up your dinner ticket, which you'll also need at the bar, at least for your first drink. We are interested in your opinions about this program. Please go to the URL displayed on the screen behind me at your convenience and complete a short evaluation. Finally, we will save the last 15 minutes or so of our time together for your questions and comments. We're going to have staff here on this floor and upstairs. If you have a comment or question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to come to you. Do not grab the microphone. It has to stay with the staff person. Do not make long speeches. We want everyone who wishes to say something to have an opportunity to do that. We have only 15 minutes at most. So please cooperate by being succinct and direct and say what you'd like to say or ask the question that you'd like to ask. Okay, let's begin. There are extended biographies of our panelists and moderator in your printed program, so I will be very brief. To my far left, your right, is James Forman, Jr. James is a former Washington, D.C. public defender, currently a clinical professor of law at Yale University, Yale Law School, I'm sorry. And he's writing a book on African American attitudes towards law enforcement in the age of mass incarceration. Next to James is Tommie Shelby. Tommie is a professor of philosophy and African American studies at Harvard University and the author of We Who Are Dark, Philosophical Foundations of Black Solidarity. Next to Tommie is Danielle Allen. Danielle is the director of the Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard, a MacArthur genius, and author of Talking to Strangers, Anxieties of Citizenship Since Brown v. Board of Education, and more recently, a wonderful book, which I recommend to you. It's a little off topic, but not entirely, called Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in defense of equality. And lastly, our moderator, Douglas Blackmon, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and historian, author of a wonderful book, Slavery by Another Name, the re-enslavement of African Americans from the Civil War to Black re-enslavement from the Civil War to World War II, made into a blockbuster movie, by the way. Doug is also program director at the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia, and I'll now turn it over to Doug Blackmon. Thanks, Doug.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you all for coming out on what looks like it was turning into a pretty day outside. But we're not going to start with elaborate formal statements, but instead I thought I would just say a couple of things and then let the panelists begin to react to that and to each other. And we look forward to hearing your questions a little bit later. But this is an issue that we have all been talking about, or choosing not to talk about, which is a commission of its own for the past couple of years in a way that seems much more active than it had been for some time. And all of that obviously spurred initially by, depending on where you want to pick the beginnings of the current period, was it the Trayvon Martin incident or was it Ferguson? But Ferguson seems to have been the moment at which this particular dialogue took on a different character in the national discourse. And then sadly, we have had too many opportunities for it to be rejuvenated since then. But I have had a sense of frustration through that whole process, that it seemed to me that while we have had confirmed our greatest fears about certain dimensions of the criminal justice system over that period of time, and we have seen a great outpouring of frustration and anger at times and real energy around discussion, but I haven't heard very many new things. I haven't heard many responses that made me say to myself, no, that's a voice I really want to listen to. That's a new voice that maybe could lead us out of this wilderness somehow. I haven't had that reaction, and I've despaired somewhat about the absence of that. I do think that the Black Lives Matter movement, as kind of unformed as that is, there is something in the quality of Black Lives Matter that does have some other dimensions to it that are new, and I'll be curious to hear what others might think about that. But maybe we'll just start at the very end and then just go very in an unorchestrated way. But what's your sense? Has this been a constructive dialogue, or are we stuck?
Well, both. So we're stuck for sure, but I do think I'm maybe a little bit more optimistic than you are in terms of the moment that we're in. I agree with you in terms of I'm not sure that there have been so many brand new ideas or fresh insights, but I think that's sort of okay in the sense that I think that we have some clear ideas of what needs to be done. What we actually need is political mobilization and energy and activism and pressure to make that happen. So I think in some ways, I'm maybe a little more, I guess in particular, maybe optimistic about what I see as some of the activism that's going on. Because I think that if you look particularly in the criminal justice system, for the last 30 or 40 years, people have been pushing, they've been complaining, there's been, complaints about racial injustice, complaints about over-incarceration, complaints about police brutality, but it's never been galvanized. And now we are at that moment. And, if you look back to the earlier civil rights movement, I mean, why was it that all of a sudden when students went to sit in lunch counters and when there was the Montgomery bus boycott, these weren't new problems. People had been talking about them. They had been out there. But then there was a moment when, for whatever reason that we probably never really will be able to know, there was a spark, and then a movement built out of that. So we don't know yet whether this is going to be anything like that, but I am more hopeful because I see people talking about this issue of racial justice and policing in particular and mass incarceration in a way that I have never seen in the 15 or 20 years that I've been working on it.
I think I probably have a similar view that maybe take a piece from both of you. Had the same reaction to feeling that there's not a lot of new ideas I should also say, I'm a sort of student of the history of Black political thought, and for those of us who read those debates over time from abolitionists through civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, have seen some of these same ideas bandied about in the 60s and early 70s. So there's a sense in which I don't see a lot new, but I do think that what you might have thought that what you've had is a kind of lull of sort of broad-based mobilization, especially amongst young people, and to see that kind of energized movement picking up from an earlier time, I think is a great thing. I would, of course, prefer if more of that activism was informed by a sort of history, by a knowledge of that history, and those debates, and that people would have learned from some of the things we've seen when you followed the history of the Black Panther Party, which also was very much focused on criminal justice issues. That was very much a big part of what they were about, to sort of take some lessons from what they did and think about ways you might, use the media in various ways, but be careful about the ways in which you use the media. Think about how you might interface with electoral politics. Think about how you might do both direct action and mobilize people in more mainstream political action. So I find myself optimistic about in those ways, and I think if the dialogue continues between those of us who may be somewhat older, have more experience in thinking about these things, we're in dialogue with younger people who are being politicized in a way that they haven't been in recent years. I think we might see more of a tighter connection between that history and our current moment.
And before Danielle says anything, we should all send her warm thoughts and gratitude, because we've literally dragged her from her sick room to be here this afternoon. So,
right.
Yes.
It's a pleasure, and thank you, David, for the invitation. And though, having said that, I'm going to do the ungracious thing of beginning by disagreeing with my host. You should never do that, but anyway. You said in your introduction that the Declaration of Independence is a little off topic, and in fact it's not. And I want to say why it's not. Or you knew I was going to come after you. There we go. Its core concept is equality. Is that me making sure? Okay. That's right. It was immediately a resource for the abolitionist movement. So in this town, in Boston, I just moved to Boston, so I get to say in my town for the first time, Prince Hall, December 1776, January 1777, uses the Declaration, quotes it, the second sentence, to launch the case for abolition. Vermont abolishes slavery, 1780. Massachusetts does too, with its constitution, which judges interpret as abolishing slavery, 1780. Pennsylvania passes an Emancipation and Abolition Act. It's a long, gradual abolition, but they passed that in 1780. We forget these facts about our history, but they started with the Declaration. That abolitionist tradition is central to our shared tradition, and it is grounded in the Declaration. And it matters that Lincoln, fighting slavery ultimately, pragmatic he was, yes, but ultimately fighting slavery, described that war as consisting of a fight about a nation that was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Martin Luther King, as you all know, thought that this document was just as important for the civil rights movement, and it is important now too. And I want to be very specific about why it's important, because it's not actually the obvious reason of the invocation of the ideal of equality. Yes, that's fundamental, but there's something else as well. And so I'm going to do the thing I always do, pardon me, and I remind you of the content of the second sentence. Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these, examples, not exhaustive list, but among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, as is the case now, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish them and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle and organizing its power in such form, that's the important part, I'll come back to that, as shall to them seem most likely, probabilistic judgment, to affect their safety and happiness. What's the importance of organizing the powers of government in such form as to us shall seem most likely to affect our safety and happiness? It forces us to ask the question about how the powers of government are organized. Our problems do not descend from the sky. They do not come from outside our borders. We create them with how we organize the powers of government. And with the laws about drugs, we have created our current world. I could say a lot more about that, but that is the fundamental source of our problem.
Thank you. Let's go further into that, and because the discussion of the war on drugs is so central to so much of the discussion about this, and has also surfaced this debate. It may be a debate that everyone on each side is correct about, one of those sorts of debates, but there is this debate, first of whether the balance between enforcement and prosecution versus the danger to society of incarceration and the loss of and citizens' loss of freedom, and this struggle between which is more important, to have unfettered liberty versus to deal with the existential threat that citizens may feel from crime. That balancing act is at the heart of a lot of the debate about this over time. And now, in more recent times, we've heard a lot more about the Rockefeller drug laws being the beginnings of this, or perhaps, and some would say the President Clinton's crime bill in 1996, or there are other milestones in this path. There's no doubt that those laws and the penalties that they demanded have been the instruments for the creation of the gigantic mass incarceration that we have today. At the same time, I've heard Attorney General Holder, now former Attorney General Holder, has talked with me a couple of times about when he was the U.S. Attorney in Washington, going out to housing projects in D.C., meeting with a tenant association, talking with them about ideas that he had or new programs that they were developing to try to divert young men into treatment programs and ways keeping people out of jail, and then sitting there typically with a group of elderly African-American ladies who are living in this project, don't have much mobility. They're saying to him, well, thank you, Mr. Holder. Those are all good ideas, and we appreciate that you care about our grandsons. But before you leave tonight, would you arrest all the young men who are sitting on the stoop of my apartment building? Because I'm afraid when I walk back to my apartment. And so that tension between that it was African Americans who felt the existential threat of the crime, the heightened levels of crime at certain periods of time, more so than anybody else, including at the time of the Rockefeller drug laws, and yet when crime rates then began to fall, for reasons that are still somewhat unclear, people looked around and said, gosh, what happened? Where did all the young African-American men go? I mean, that overstates it. And suddenly this mass incarceration debate burst open in a much more dramatic way. But that tension between law enforcement and the consequences of what we've ended up with. It seems to be at the very center of all this.
So I think to some extent, some of the problem has been misunderstood in terms of the sources of different parts of this. So just a few basics. Who knows how much Americans spend every year buying illegal drugs? Just out of curiosity. If you think you know the answer, just put your hand up. I won't call on you, I promise. I'm just curious.
I have no experience in that realm. No knowledge base.
$100 billion. Okay, what's our defense budget? $600 billion. Okay, so that tells you how much there's a broad acceptance at this point of drug use. And it is equal opportunity. The rates of drug usage are completely the same across ethnic groups. Now, can you move $100 billion worth of anything that's illegal without a lot of crime? Can you imagine such a thing? I consider that unimaginable. So it's very hard to sort out high levels of crime from illegality, yet a culture that is demanding these illegal products at a very high rate. So I'll just think about that, how those pieces fit together. And then the second piece, percentage of cases filed in state courts annually, or at least 2013, new filings, nonviolent drug offenses, 32%. Okay, if you've got a criminal justice system, 32% of your time is being, I will say, in my view, wasted. How are you going to allocate resources effectively to things like prosecuting homicide, which you need to do if you're going to bring homicide rates down? So the question of how the different pieces interact with each other is extremely complicated. And so yes, people see crime and they want crime enforced, and they should want crime enforced against. But what is actually preventing us from enforcing against or prosecuting some of the relevant crime? The war on drugs. So it's really, the causal arrows are very complicated.
So I want to jump in about sort of what Eric Holder has to say in his invocation of the elderly black women that he met with as the reason why we needed to fight the war on drugs or the war on crime the way we needed to. So I was in DC as a public defender during the time that Eric Holder was the US attorney for DC. And he's right that when you went to community meetings, you heard what he's reporting. But you also heard other things. You also heard people asking for jobs, first and foremost. I mean, the March on Washington was the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. The jobs part, we've almost forgotten about historically. And that carries through. I mean, the kids that I represented in DC as a public defender, when I would ask them, what was it that they needed? What was it they wanted? What was it that would cause them to not come back and be my clients again? Over and over and over again, they told me jobs. They wanted basically two things. They wanted jobs and they wanted better school. Now, here's the problem with what's happened in urban policy over the last 30 or 40 years. Black communities have been demanding more police, more prosecutions, and things like a Marshall Plan for the cities, things like more jobs. Our government has been organized in such a way to provide one and not the other. That is to say, those communities have overwhelmingly gotten only the police and prosecution half of that. And that has produced the dynamic that we have today. So that's number one. The second thing is, I agree with the war on drugs critique, but I think it's also really fundamental that we not make the mistake of talking about leniency and mercy in the criminal justice system the way we are doing now, but exclusively limit it to nonviolent offenders or people in the war on drugs. This is what President Obama does consistently. It's what Eric Holder does. President Obama said, I don't have any mercy. I don't have any compassion for people who commit a violent offense. Well, that's just wrong. And we need to figure out a way to have a conversation that focuses on drug policy, that focuses on the harms caused by the war on drugs, but doesn't lop off everybody else who commits a robbery or commits a burglary or commits a drug offense with a weapon involved, right? And say they are forever beyond redemption. They are outside of our capacity for care and compassion and second chances and mercy. And one of my biggest fears right now about the way our conversation is going in terms of criminal justice reform is precisely that.
I entirely agree. Let me see if I can connect a couple of these points. We have to think about, on the jobs question, as you point out in the civil rights movement, this was a big part of it, the economic justice, connecting economic justice with racial justice. And I think it's one of the things that you do see, while it's not new, I think it's great that it exists in the new movement, is that connecting questions of racial justice with questions of economic justice. And that's a pretty consistent message that you get in a lot of the activism on the ground right now. But one feature of the focus on jobs, and way we conceptualize the provision of jobs is that we think that a person shouldn't be able to live decently unless they have a full-time job. There are a lot of people who have very limited skills, and in our current economy, there's not a lot of space for those people, other than cleaning the houses, looking after the kids of affluent people. And then another piece of that, there's questions of gender. Again, the activism on the ground is also very much, especially in Black Lives Matter, very much focused on questions of gender. A lot of that service work is, of course, is typically done by women, leaving very little space in the current economy for young men with sort of limited skills and education. So I think we have to think about, when we focus on economic justice, when we're thinking about racial justice at the same time, about what would it mean to share the benefits of our economic cooperation in a fair way, and find places for a lot of these young men who might be attracted to meet that large demand that Professor Allen was mentioning for provision of drugs. They'll find other ways of fitting into that economy that are not just about meeting that demand. I think the other side of it is you have to think a bit about what happens with the violent offenders and once they are released, because often they are released, and we don't do a very good job of thinking about what their place is going to be in society. I think we have to think a lot harder about what it means to reconcile with those who've wronged us by violating our laws, and leaving them in a state of perpetual, unending stigma, where they're outside of they can't find jobs, it's hard to find housing, they can't get educational benefits and subsidies that will allow them to get more training, and you're just pushing them right back into that same economy, meeting that same demand, and finding themselves right back in prison again. So unless we think harder about what it means to reintegrate offenders back into our society, treating them as our equals and as full members, and not just people who we need to kind of suppress and contain, it's very hard to see how you can make much progress if you don't deal with that side of it.
Let me try to sharpen this discussion a little bit, in the sense of make it more uncomfortable. Because I think we're hearing a couple of different things. We're mostly talking about pretty thoughtful assessments of how various systems of our society don't work very well, that we don't do a good job of rehabilitating people who get arrested, and we really maybe don't even try very hard to do that anymore, and how law enforcement works, whether the resources are allocated in the way that would make the most sense for the citizenry. And I'll just say my personal view is, and I've moved a lot in my personal views over the last 10 years as I have looked at some of these things much more closely. I'm known more for things I've written about fairly distant past, but over the last 10 years I've focused very much so on the justice system, and have come to say that this is not a political statement toward any party, but I tend to say about the justice system today what a lot of Republicans say about the Affordable Care Act, and that is that it needs to be pulled out of the ground by the roots. That it is so inherently based on a system that was designed to fail so large a portion of the population for so long that it is likely impossible to reform it in the way that we think of reform. But those are structural, institutional issues. What we're really talking about most in the country is a black-white one, or is a racial one. So, to the three of you, do you perceive that the problems we're dealing with are structural deficiencies that fail everyone, or is there a specific racism-driven dimension to all of this, and that is the explanation for the outsized incarceration of African Americans specifically? Is it racism or is it structure?
So I think it's structure that intersects with a society that has had a history of racism, though I would actually put the emphasis on the structural side of things. So what do I mean by that exactly? I think, yes, the drug laws are fundamentally misconceived. Compare them to tobacco control, and you get a very powerful counterexample. We've cut smoking in half since 1964. Drug usage is the same now as it was in the early 70s when we launched the drug war. It's gone up and down some, but it's the same as it was in the early 70s. Zero progress. Okay, so you have a way of treating this as a public health problem. That is to say, you don't have to give up fighting drugs. You just don't have to fight them through criminalization. You can fight them as a public health problem. Okay, so there's a fundamental policy choice that has then resulted in disparate application. And what's the source of the disparate application? To some extent, it does have to do with racism, I would argue. To some extent, it does have to do with disproportion in terms of rates of who's committing crimes, and those things come together. But the other important issue is to come to the policing question specifically, and the image we have of white violence on black people. You take those cases, and I think there's two important things to say about them. And so I'm sorry, one of them comes back to the structural point again, and one to the racism point. So economists have pointed out, and I think this is right, that where you have a situation where homicides are going unpunished, you get a trigger-happy equilibrium. Because if you know that the guy that you're facing, you might get, is going to have a good chance of getting away with it, you're more likely to shoot first and to shoot to kill. Right? It's just best defense is a strong offense becomes the sort of norm that governs in those spaces. And police too end up trigger happy in that context. So there's a structural reason that people in urban settings with high drug traffic are trigger happy. Okay? Now, but then the question is, how does trigger happiness play out? And that's where I think psychologists have done a lot of research lately that has identified something called implicit bias, okay, which is you don't think of yourself as a racist person, everything you would want to say about race is positive and egalitarian, but they can measure this with these very sophisticated tests. You actually, do value white lives higher than black lives. And so the Black Lives Matter campaign is very nicely targeted at a phenomenon that psychologists have identified. And it is not only white people in this country who have implicit bias against black people do too. We all do. The whole culture, our symbols, our aesthetic elements, prioritizes the value of white lives over the value of black lives. And so in a trigger-happy setting where police officers do engage, sort of tests have shown, routinely have, in fact, implicit bias, you get the results of consistent white on black violence of extreme and egregious kinds.
And so James, you pick up on this too, but also as you do, you wrote a critique of Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, if I'm remembering right, which has become a kind of cornerstone document of so much of the discussion of the past couple of years. And there are now a bunch of other books that are also in that milieu. But Michelle's, I'm oversimplifying it, but basically argues that these heightened enforcement and draconian legal measures were essentially a backlash against the successes of the civil rights movement. There was a fairly explicit racial motivation to the creation of this regime. And you're writing about some of those things now, I take it, in the book that you're working on. But yeah, pick that up.
Well, no, I mean, look, I think it was one of those that particular article was intended to be one of those sort of friendly critiques, like there's a lot of great stuff here, but let me sort of push at what's missing. So I think I'm probably, I guess I would say, I view Black Americans in this context as almost like the sort of the canary in the coal mine. So I think that you look at lack of wealth, joblessness, drugs, trigger-happy culture, and you see in the Black community the highest levels of crime, the highest levels of incarceration, the highest levels of police violence. All those things are real and true. But it's also the case that we incarcerate more poor white people in this country than any other country in the world does. I mean, you can go to states where there are very few Black people in the state, and you go into the prisons, and you see the same lack of rehabilitation. You see the same inhumane conditions. Now, the rates of incarceration aren't as high, and that's the racism part. But the rates of incarceration are incredibly high by international standards and by American historic standards, and that's the structure part. So I think looking at how these, all of these forces together have decimated Black communities with one, and we've been talking about criminal justice, but the criminal justice system is only one element of it, right? We've talked about jobs, we've talked about wealth, we could talk about education. It's across the board. We see that through Black communities, but what we're seeing is a national problem. It's a national problem of growing inequality.
I would, on the structure versus racism question, what I would maybe add just two quick points. One, in the survey research that I've read, I've been very lucky to have a lot of colleagues who do survey research on racial attitudes, and one of them, Lawrence Bowe, has done a fair bit of work on the connection between racial attitudes and attitudes of punitiveness. And so what you see is a negative racial attitude, especially negative racial attitudes toward Blacks, and heightened punitiveness kind of go together. So one way in which you might see racial bias is in how heavy the penalties are. People often talk about mass incarceration, where they're sort of focused on just the sort of sheer number of people in there. But I think probably more significantly is the length of time that they're in there, right? So the punishments are really, really high for a lot of these crimes. Some of them you might think not bad, but not the kind of crimes that would mean 30 years of your life. And if you're there for so long, it's very unclear how you're going to come back into society. Plus, crime is really a young person's game, if you like. I mean, people typically age out of it. A lot of the crimes done by young people, when they hit middle age, they're not really inclined to do it. So it doesn't really make sense to hold them for so long. So the bias toward like heavy penalties, very unforgiving penalties, I think is connected to racial bias. The other way in which you might think racial bias comes in is on, in some ways, the kind of lack of concern of what happens to the people who are having confrontations with the police, or who find themselves in our criminal justice system, or in prison. Just a general apathy, indifference toward their lives, toward the lives of their families who are deeply affected by it. And I think that's another way in which racial bias comes in, that's connected to the structural points, but is, I think, distinct from it, which is just, and again, this is, I guess, a question about Black Lives Matter, about the weight that's given to the lives of Black people seems just much less than the weight you're giving to the, and if you saw anything like the kind of damage that's done to Black communities done in white communities, I just can't imagine that people would just be so apathetic about it.
Yeah, and a similar point has been made. This gets away from criminal justice issues and incarceration, but I was listening to someone very recently talking about how the unemployment rate among African Americans today has finally come down to about 9%. I think its peak was 16% or 17% at the worst of the recession. And this person was making the observation that if white unemployment had reached a number like 17% or even 9%, what it is today, when unemployment among whites was at 10%, it was being talked about as an absolute catastrophe, and that demanded all of the measures that were taken by both President Bush and President Obama, giving credit to both of them, to save our economy and the world's. But it was that specter of 10% unemployment among whites that really drove that, and the sense of absolute catastrophe that would set in if you had 17% unemployment among white males in America is, I think, undeniable. But we have almost no reaction to that on a broad basis to African Americans. But I do think all this conversation is getting at what a muddled picture we have. The incarceration of black males has actually been flat for the past, for several years now. I mean, exactly where it is, we don't know, because our system is so sloppy. There's so much about the system we don't know. We actually don't know how many, anyone in this room, if you ask the question out loud, I wonder how many people in America are on death row. Well, you could get an answer to that very quickly. You could call the Sentencing Project in Washington, D.C., or any number of other places. They'll immediately tell me how many people are on death row. But if you want to know how many people are serving sentences that must actually be served of 75 years or more, or 50 years or more, which are effectively death sentences as well, nobody knows. Now, 3 or 4 of us could get together and call every State Department of Corrections, over the course of a few days and come up with a number that's somewhat accurate. But in reality, nobody knows. Nobody knows.
We don't even know the number of people killed by police in a given year.
Exactly. It took the New York Times and some other, journalism organizations to try to figure that out.
This, I think, is an actually incredibly important point, because it points to the way in which different issues in our society intersect with each other. All of the issues that we're talking about have to be dealt with fundamentally at the state level. Fundamentally, the architecture of the system that we're talking about is state architecture. It's not that the federal architecture is irrelevant, but the state architecture is the bulk of it. There's this issue of getting data. It has to be done at the state level. Our politics and our journalism have evacuated the state sphere. We don't cover state houses any longer. We don't cover local politics. And so there's a question of how do you rebuild civic engagement at the state level? And if I were, on the phone with the Black Lives Matter people, in fact, I've been meaning to reach out to them and say this, I think the most important thing that they need to do is build a state-by-state strategy, figure out which are the states that you cascade first, which are the states that you transform first, and let them be the cascading ones that drive everything, which, I will add, was the same strategy that John Adams and Richard Henry Lee used in order to provoke the Declaration of Independence.
Well, and one other data point to throw in to stimulate this, while the incarceration of African American males has been flat for some time and perhaps is going down, it may have also ticked back up again. But the fastest growing cohort of Americans being incarcerated right now, by far, are white females. Now that's because it started at such a low base. But if you look at the data, the incarceration of white females is skyrocketing, and of course that's driven by some very specific drug use related phenomenons. But I see in all of that, in this muddled picture, what I call the democratization of poverty, or you might call it the democratization of the unloved, or whatever but this status in American society, which was once substantially reserved for African Americans, and for a certain group of African Americans who were viewed as being even less worthy than middle class African Americans in some respects, but that all of the dehumanizing and the tolerance for bad things to happen to that group of people, we're increasingly a merciless society that is comfortable with those things happening to a much larger group of very poor, powerless people.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that it's another example of something that, in some ways, we saw first in the African American community, and now we're seeing more broadly. I mean, starting, well, really forever, but certainly starting shortly after the Civil Rights Movement in the 1970s, this really took off. You started to see all of these conversations about sort of divides within the Black community, how it was that now we had this new group of Black Americans that was for the first time able to take leadership roles in public life and to be economically middle class or upper middle class, or even in one or a couple of instances, upper class. And then we had, the stories of all of the, African Americans then left behind, right? And so this notion that we have this division in the Black community is something that we've been talking about, certainly in Black America and somewhat as a nation, for quite some time. And what you're talking about now is that same idea as an American problem. Now, I do think, and this is where it gets, where we have to be sort of analytically specific and we have to be subtle, we need to be able to talk about that at the same time as we not lose sight of the fact that there are these unique and extreme problems of Black poverty. There's a way in which Black Americans are locked out of the opportunity to advance. I'm talking about poor Black Americans who lack wealth, who have their wealth being stolen from them from banks and rapacious lenders, are locked out of American society, are subject to all of these implicit biases, and that's unique. So it's uniquely awful, but it's also becoming more broadly democratized. And we've got to be able to hold on to both of those things, and too often I feel like in our national conversation, it's an either or. Either somebody starts to talk about Black poverty and then the rebuttal to that is, oh, well, we've got a lot of, white poverty as well. Well, that can't be a rebuttal, but it's also got to be held up as true.
Yeah, one of the difficult things on this point, I mean, it's in a way, I've written a little bit about Barack Obama's writings about racial justice, and he's, I think, quite good at diagnosing on this particular point. Because, when you think about Black Lives Matter, when the reaction to the slogan and how it got a lot of negative reaction to it, so what's at issue is like what you're talking about, right? So what you want, and this is the trick, right? What you want is a way for other people who are not Black but are unjustly disadvantaged in a range of ways to be able to acknowledge that pain and that suffering that Blacks have experienced for a long time, to appreciate the specific circumstances that many disadvantaged Black people find themselves in. And you also want for those of us who spend a lot of our time fighting for disadvantaged Black people, to be able to acknowledge the pain that others who are not Black are also feeling. So it's a very hard thing for some reason. I'm not sure why that is, but and you would think you can make a lot more progress on these questions of racial and economic justice if we could find a way to be able to acknowledge how these injustices affect these groups without anyone feeling threatened that their interests are not going to be taken seriously if we move forward. I wish I had a solution, but I don't. But I do think that is the crux of the matter.
And there is even a legal link between these two issues, in that if you try to challenge treatment in the prison context, medical care, provision of medical care, and so forth, it is actually a principle of law that you can't do more for prisoners than is done for people who are out of prison, right? Which means that our standard for thinking about prisoners is actually our standard for thinking about the floor. And so, paradoxically, if we could be serious about treating prisoners better, we'd have to be better about how we thought about poor Americans generally. Because a lot of the reason we can't do things like education in prisons, good health care in prisons, is because we don't do that for people who aren't in prison. That's not really okay.
Well, reach back again to the founders who you've invoked for us. It's not often that the founders get invoked in these sorts of dialogues. So it's good that you're here to bring the Declaration into that. But one of the few things that I would say perhaps is an optimistic sign at the moment, that if it turns out to be legitimate, is that there begins to be some discussion between civil libertarians that you would generally say are on the far right of the political spectrum and people more on the left about things like mass incarceration. I think we have this bedrock issue in America that we're a country that has been astonishingly successful at defeating a kind of individual racism that was completely pervasive in an earlier time, but we've been unable to defeat collective racism, which basically boils down to that the majority of white people still don't really give a damn that most black kids have far more obstacles in their lives than most white kids do. That's the simplest thing. But, and that seems to get in the way of these, what ought to be naturally aligned interests finding each other. But now we do see, you know, we've got a Rand Paul talking about mass incarceration at the same time that President Obama is, and the Koch brothers participating with President Obama in something that relates to all this. But so the founders, as ardent civil libertarians, should have, one would assume they would be incredibly horrified at the idea that the government was intruding into the lives of so many people in this dramatic way.
On one level, I would say yes, although I always hesitate because the founders disagreed amongst themselves profoundly, and you could find very different points of view on given issues. And so some were people that you could call civil libertarians in our own context and case. I mean, there are others who are much more thoroughly democratic populists in a different kind of way. And, you know, Thomas Paine argued for Social Security, basically. We forget that about him. So I myself don't invoke something that the founders thought. You have to ask me what Adams thought or what Jefferson thought and so forth.
A founder.
But yes, I think if you use the lens of the Declaration of Independence and ask the question about how we are organizing the powers of government and whether our organization of the powers of government is achieving the safety and happiness of the people, and just like go through the legal system, the whole legal system in your mind and sort of check, like, does that one help safety and happiness of people? Yes. That one, no. I think there are a list of grievances in the Declaration. We could easily produce a version of such a list based on the current way in which we organize the powers of government. And I think at the center of it would be these issues. And yes, I think you're right, that there are people in both parties who would endorse that assessment that we've failed with regard to how we're organizing the powers of government.
But so does that feel like a legitimate thing that's happening now? Could it actually go somewhere?
Well, so I'm not going to address it from the founders or a founder standpoint, but I'm glad you brought up this notion of that we're in this moment when we have this left-right alliance on criminal justice reform, and you have the Koch brothers and Rand Paul. And I want to say big caution here. And the reason is this. Many of the things that we are going to need to do if we want to have a more progressive, more rehabilitative, more just system that protects communities and doesn't stigmatize and degrade those who are convicted of crimes, many of those things are going to cost more money. Many of them. Right now, in most states, including in Massachusetts, public defenders are dramatically underfunded. I just met with one of my students, one of my graduates. She's at one of the premier public defender's offices in the country. She has 140 cases pre-trial. None of us wants a lawyer that has 140 cases that has 3 or 4 set for trial a day. Nobody's talking about reinvigorating our system of public defense when the mantra for criminal justice reform and the alliance is around how we can save money.
What percentage of her cases are drug cases? Do you have any idea?
I didn't ask her.
But you would assume what?
Mine, when I was a public defender, it depended on where, as you move up, you get a different caseload, but typically about 25%. To make our prisons, I mean, one of the things that I spent a lot of time working on is how we can improve our education system for kids who are in the juvenile justice system. And I helped to start a program in DC that runs a model school inside DC's juvenile jail. It's one of the best schools in the country for inside a juvenile facility. And it costs money. It's more expensive than to just put a kid in a corner with a computer and let them play games, video games, which is what happens in a lot of So a lot of what we're talking about, whether it's prison conditions, whether it's public defenders, whether it's policing reform, these things, whether it's investing in homicide, in the homicide branch so that they can actually solve crimes and make it less likely that somebody then feels like they have to shoot, all those things are going to be expensive.
But we could get somewhere just by redirecting current expenditures, right? $193 billion a year spent fighting drugs, so $100 billion spent consuming drugs, $193 billion in the cost of
Oh, I totally
dealing
agree
with
with that. But that's not what's none of the bills are, let's reduce the length of, the bills that say let's keep people in for not so long on drug offenses, one of which just passed, the Senate at least. The money that's being saved isn't going into the public defender system. So yes, you're right, we could do that.
Yeah.
And that's important too. I mean, there's a way in which we've been emphasizing questions of economic justice, but this is really basic liberties, right? I mean, we're really talking at the level of, due process is fundamental basic liberty. It's not a matter of economic justice, and that requires the right institutions to make that possible. And including, you want to convey to citizens that they can expect due process. And I think a lot of the skepticism and resentment that people have around the criminal justice system is they feel like it is not organized in a way to ensure that they will get fair treatment at each stage, at the level of interacting with the police, with the prosecutors, what's going to happen whether you face a judge or a jury, if in a few cases when you do, what's going to happen in prison, what's going to happen when you get out. I think people have very little confidence that this most fundamental liberty, that you're gonna get due process when someone has charged you with a crime. We don't have that, and that can't happen without institutional infrastructure to secure it.
And that is a place where I would be willing to say the founders would agree, in the sense that, I would say it's important not to actually think of basic liberties and economic justice as fully separate from one another. They are not actually, partitionable concepts. You can't actually even develop material success if you haven't secured basic liberties. So in that regard, if it's a conversation about economic justice, it's still sort of step one is about securing basic liberties. Basic liberties make it possible to do things like, continue with your education years of not having a criminal record and so forth. So a whole lot of economic justice issues are tied up with the fact that basic liberties have gone unprotected.
Yeah, and that's much the point that I was trying to get at when I asked you about the founders before, that my sense that frankly, just a level of horror that they would express at the idea of a government that, whether it intended to or not, had ended up amassing the sort of power that it has and then exercises it the way that it does. This would be viewed as completely antithetical to almost everything that almost all of them did stand for in some respect. Yeah. Disagreed about many things, but this idea that the government has this capacity to reach literally into the homes of so many people and pull their children out, stick them in prison under these circumstances. It also terrifies me, and I think we have to start winding this in and try to take some questions. But the other thing that, by the way, I'll just make an observation before I say this. I'm so surprised by the dialogue that we've had. It's very different than the one that I expected. Well, thank you. Well, great. Yeah, and all credit to you guys.
We know what to expect.
Yeah, right. It's much worse. Exactly. It's terror. I was expecting something grand. No. I really thought I was going to end up in a discussion that would be overwhelmingly about Black Lives Matter and the sort of sharpest racial dimension of the current dialogue, just because that's what is so much on the minds of people. This has been a very thoughtful, wide-ranging examination about some really profound things, and so I thank you all for that. But the other observation I was going to make was, I'm a depressing dinner party guest because I like to do this, but if the topic comes up of some of these issues, I will say to someone that, and typically this will be another middle-class white person like me, or somebody who's not white, but a bourgeois, comfortable person like myself, but I'll say to someone, the odds of us being falsely accused of robbing a liquor store are extremely low, because our demographic cohort doesn't rob liquor stores, generally speaking, and so we'll never be picked up and charged mistakenly with something like that. But we do kill our spouses with some frequency, and other people that we love.
And those are the homicides that get solved, too.
Exactly.
It's true.
But so the odds of being falsely accused of a crime like that do exist. They're not infinitesimal. And I say to someone, if you are ever falsely accused of such a crime, and you truly are innocent of it, pray that if you are to be convicted, pray that you are sentenced to death. Because if you are not sentenced to death, in a very short period of time, you will expend all your resources in your defense. In a short time after that, anyone else who still is sticking with you will expend all of their resources. Sometime after that, your children will stop coming to see you. Your spouse is already gone at the hands of someone else. Before very long at all, your mother will be the only person who ever contacts you again, and then she will die because she's older than you, and then you will sit in prison and never see a lawyer the last 20 or 30 years you are there until you finally die of cancer, unless they have actually prevented you from smoking that entire time. On the other hand,
invite you to dinner a
they
second
do
time?
not. On the other hand, if you are sentenced to death, there are insufficient resources there, but there is at least a significant, there are people who will go to great lengths to try to keep you from being executed. But if you are not sentenced to death, then this government will rot you to death with almost no intervention from any other person. And for me, that's a profoundly depressing thing, and also depressing, back to the earlier point that I made. We have no idea how many of those people there are. But the number is huge. There are many, and that's a whole other conversation about false convictions and such, but the number is very large, and the data tells us that. But let's try to talk in the last few minutes we take, before we take some questions. We've heard one suggestion of an actual initiative, and that is that Black Lives Matter needs to build a state-by-state system that I think is very wise, and that's another way of saying it needs to move beyond a broad message of anger and inspiration and into something that is...
Well, I would say they've already moved beyond that.
Okay.
So I would push back on your representation of Black Lives Matter. But I think they could have a state-by-state organizing strategy, which they have to some extent already, but it's not necessarily always focused on state laws. And so that's sort of the specific point that I would add.
But what else? What else do we have that we should that we would want to leave this audience with? As things to vote for someone or against someone about?
Pay attention to their answers on the drug war at the debates. Nobody's given us good answers on that question yet.
All right. You're the only person here with good ideas.
I told you I was a broken record on the subject. I warned him in advance. So I said I'm a broken record on the drug war.
Well, I guess mine would be, so in terms of what it is that we do in the policy realm and kind of what you demand of your elected officials, for me, these questions of economic justice and job creation would be the things that I would put at the top of the list. But I want to broaden it to also think about not just what we can demand of elected officials, but what we can do ourselves and the influence that we can have in the people around us. Because these are criminal justice issues, but they're more than criminal justice issues. So if we're at a humanities event, I think the first thing that is worth it to do is to read. I did not realize how few of my students knew anything about Reconstruction or the Civil Rights Movement. I asked them, and I was teaching some cases from Reconstruction, and I said kind of in a joking manner because I didn't want anybody to feel, I wanted them to be able to answer honestly, and I thought they were all going to say that they were familiar with, because they wouldn't want to admit that they hadn't read anything about Reconstruction. Here they are in law school. And I asked them, I said, so are you like an expert in this area, you know a little bit, or you know nothing? And the majority of students in class raised their hand on the know nothing. This is at one of America's elite law schools. Now, so they could start with my book. My book's not out yet, so it's not out there for y'all to pick up. But there are 3 books out there, and they can start with those. So I think that's important. But I also think asking the question, kind of bringing it close to home, because it's so easy to think about, well, what can somebody else do, or how can the police operate differently? But I think that we all have a certain amount of individual responsibility to try to solve some of these problems ourselves. I mean, at my law school, for example, has the same number of Black professors today that it did 25 years ago. That's intolerable. And most people, and when I talk to my colleagues, many of whom work on these issues, care about these issues, fight against discrimination in their writing, and then I say, okay, so let's talk about what we can do right here in our little piece of the world then there's a lot of, equivocation and obfuscation. So I think all of us can look at our lives, look at the spaces in which we operate, the businesses that we run, the organizations that we're a part of, and ask, what would it mean to bring racial justice considerations into that space, into our space? So I would ask for folks to bring it close to home.
I just want to reiterate the point. I taught for 15 years at Harvard, and I've taught a lot of undergraduates who are very smart, and they also know almost nothing about U.S. history, and particularly know very little about U.S. history as it relates to issues of race. People often call for a conversation on race, and often get frustrated because I don't want a conversation on race unless people are informed. It's very hard to have a productive conversation if people know very little about how we got to where we are. And so you just get accusation, counter-accusation, so I entirely agree. We have to read. And Humanities is great for this. I mean, it's important. People need to there are so many books, great books on the history of the U.S. that take seriously these questions of race. I think that will be a good start before we have these conversations so we can understand these things. One of the great things about Ta-Nehisi Coates' case for reparations is it gives you like a nice, well-written, beautifully written, history of recent history of segregation and policies that make it very difficult for people to find affordable housing where they want to live. So I think that's important. Other thing I think, though I know that none of the presidential candidates want to do this, is I think we have to reopen the discussion of welfare reform. I know no one wants to do this, but people feel like it was settled, in '96, and no one wants to go back there because welfare is so associated with black people, and the Democrats want to win, and it's hard for them to win if people think of, they're the party of black people and so on. But I think welfare reform is a disaster, and I think we have to think very hard about what it would mean to really properly share the benefits of economic growth and productivity. And I just think we just don't do this. We just think whatever it is that if the market just dictates that just a handful of people will just take the lion's share, that's just. And I think that cannot possibly be true. And so I think when we think about these questions of racial justice and economic justice and how they're connected, I do think we have to think about how we can make it possible for all of us to live reasonably decent lives with the right kind of material support that we have in an economy that is not really built to have work for people who have very limited skills. Not everybody can be an engineer. Not everyone can get a degree in applied mathematics. Some of us, and I do think that those sorts of questions about economic justice we have to question the premise, as I mentioned earlier, that the only way you are entitled to live a comfortable life, decent, where you can hold your head up and not feel stigmatized, is if you have a full-time job. This is a non-starter. So I think I would like to see those questions reopened.
Well, thank you. Let's take some questions from the audience. And we do have some folks with microphones, and so if you'd like to ask a question, give a little auction bid wave, and then pause wait until the microphone reaches you. Why don't we start there in the back corner? Didn't I see a hand over there? Oh, here it comes. All right. Okay. All right. Here we go. Let's go up top side. And if you can, if you're able, stand. Just, but it's fine if you don't. And let the I call them microphone pilots. Let the microphone pilot hold on to the microphone while you talk. And we will try to get as many questions in as we can.
First of all, I'd like to thank Mrs. Allen, Mr. Shelby, and Mr. Forman for being here today. And I had this long, question originally planned, and then you brought up welfare reform. What a lot of people don't realize, or I hope they would realize, is here in the state of Massachusetts, at one point on welfare, you used to be allowed to go to school, continuing education. So in the 70s and 80s, I believe, a lot of women actually went on to higher ed to get degrees and get off of welfare and to be able to, with dignity, support their families. As part of welfare reform, that's been diminished. And now a woman can't go to school. So my name is Kafi Dixon. I'm actually a graduate of the Clemente program in Humanities. And I wanted to ask a question about the quote that Mrs. Allen made about that word men, all men are created equal, and get back to it as far as a big debate around amongst the women that I work with is that statement men. Do you think when the Constitution was written that word men actually covered men of color as second-class citizens and then women and women of color as third and fourth-class citizens?
So thank you, that's an important question. And we do actually know what the word meant, and I will say how we know that in a second, but it did mean human beings. How do we know? There's a big passage in the draft of the Declaration that was cut out by Congress. This passage was a condemnation of the slave trade, and the language of it was a condemnation of King George for violating the sacred rights of life and liberty of a distant people who had never done him any harm or damage. And part of the violation was that he permitted men, in all caps, to be bought and sold in markets. Okay, that's not just males, right? That's females, that's children, as well as older people. The fact that it was in all caps is meaningful because this is a draft in Jefferson's handwriting. Jefferson's an incredibly complicated, hypocritical person. So we're not going to go into Jefferson for the moment, but it matters that in this particular text, he never capitalized anything. So, he was a crazy scientific innovator, and one of the things he also innovated in was in capitalization. So we owe the fact that we don't capitalize lots of words in sentences to Jefferson, among other people. But the fact that he put men in all caps, but he was underscoring the humanity of slaves, and he was underscoring the humanity of all men, women, and children. We also know that everybody else read the passage this way because Adams had a big debate with Abigail Adams, his wife, about this question. Would the new government incorporate women as voters and so forth? And the answer was, in the language I gave you, the principles of government apply to everybody. Okay, and then here was the dodge. But we're going to organize the powers of government in the masculine system. Those were Adams' words. Okay, so they recognize that the principles securing safety and happiness for everybody, understanding a basic equal human dignity for everybody, those principles apply to everybody. The question was, how are you going to organize the powers of government to make good on that? And they thought, erroneously, that the masculine system, patriarchal authority of property holders could do the job. Abigail said, you guys don't have a good track record. She did. And so if you're wrong, we'll let you try this, but if you're wrong, then we women, in her words, will have to foment for voice and representation, i.e. change the structure of the powers of government. And that we know is exactly what happened, and that is precisely what has been necessary to do at every relevant point in time, is to reconsider the questions of how the powers of government are organized and foment for voice and representation and alterations as necessary.
What a perfect response. Let's go in the corner.
Hi, I have a question for anybody who would like to speak to this. One thing that I was thinking about is kind of, we've seen Congress become this kind of place where nothing can get done, like for either party. And even in a hypothetical scenario where, let's say, there's a Democratic Congress and President, Senate, all that simultaneously, do you think these policies of like economic reform will actually include people of color, or will it just be another extension of the system that's only made to bring income equality to white men like me? So would these policies, if they could even be passed, would they even help everyone?
I mean, only if we make them. I mean, they're not on their own. I think your instinct is exactly right. We have a long tradition of passing laws of general application, and then either in the administration or in the fine print. You even see that now with things like the Affordable Care Act and the relationship between the states that haven't chose to expand Medicaid. And you can look and see that those are states that where it's disproportionately African American people and lots of poor whites as well that would benefit from it. So I think the risk that you raise is a real one, and the only response to it is our collective will and the politics and the pressure that we're willing to bring to bear. And bringing in the history, understanding, right, of what's happened before, so that we can raise that up at that moment and say, we know what this looks like. We saw it with the GI Bill, right? We saw it with redlining. There's a whole history here. We cannot repeat that. So I think it's a great question and a great fear, and it's in our capacity to change it.
And of course, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton and Martin O'Malley would all say that, of course, if they were given a Democratic Congress and were sitting in the White House, that these things would work, though they would say in different ways. I mean, Bernie Sanders would come the closest to saying, I think, what some of what we've heard of this call for that such changes can only happen, and I'm channeling them. I'm not expressing any support for anybody in particular, but it is interesting that Sanders says, and I interviewed him very recently. He's very explicit over and over again that this isn't about me. I can't accomplish any of the things that I'm saying I would do unless there is a political revolution, quote unquote, that would involve a massive kind of turning over of society. But it's also worth remembering. As cynical as I am about much of this, don't forget that we have accomplished tremendous changes in the past, even in the midst of similar kinds of problems. I mean, things like Social Security radically changed the nature of American life for all people, even though they were born out of the most corrupt kinds of racist bargains at the time. So we can change things, and I'm sure folks on the Republican side would say the same. Let's see if we can get a question from this side. Where's our microphone? Oh, okay, we'll go up top and then, okay. All right, there we go. All right, here we go.
Thank you. Oh, hello. So you were talking about issues of power and definitely changing the power structure, but I don't hear people ever talk about the issues of white supremacy, because a lot of this stuff is just, I feel, repackaged. Yes, things have changed, but I feel like they haven't changed that much. And things may change if we have that conversation about white supremacy and how it works within our structures. And I feel that's not being had. So I just wanted to hear your kind of thoughts and opinions about that.
So, do you want to go?
I can try to say something about it. I myself am not, I'm not sure the language of white supremacy is going to give us the kind of diagnosis we want. I went to, on Friday night, Alicia Garza was speaking at Memorial Church on Harvard's campus. She's one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter Network. She made a comment. She said,